Hello, welcome back to day 19 of 30 of our 30 days to Photoshop mastery. And today we're going to continue talking about content aware style tools with the content aware fill, content aware crop, and content aware move tools. Now, these tools are pretty helpful and rather advanced for what they are. So the content aware fill is what we're going to first start with, and it's really quite simple. We've talked about selections many times in this course, and also one of the things that we did yesterday with things like the patch tool, it's kind of doing content aware anyway. I just want to show you where this comes from because it helps with the other two things of content aware crop and content aware move. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on this image, and this is back to our basics image. I hope you had fun trying to clone out all these people. And we're going to use the regular content aware fill. Now, this was the thing that started all of these tools. So long before these tools existed that I showed you yesterday and some of the tools I'm going to show you today, content aware as a fill dialog was the only thing you could actually do. So the way we would use this is we're going to make a selection. So I'm going to grab my selection tool, and I'm going to select around this object, okay, this thing right here. Okay, and then I'm going to press either Shift F5 or I'm going to go to Edit and then go to Fill. Now, this is the fill dialog. You've seen me use this before where I filled a mask with white or filled a mask with black. Well, here, if we go in here to the drop down as far as contents are concerned, we can select Content Aware. Now, it's going to ask us, do we want color adaptation? Say yes, because that's going to help adapt these colors to whatever Photoshop decides to take it from. And blending mode, just leave it at normal and opacity at 100%, and then press OK. Photoshop is going to work its magic, and it's going to find something that looks very similar to that object and fill it in. If we go ahead and select this area right here, because that's the shadow that we want to get rid of, press Shift F5. It already has content aware selected, and we press OK, and that helps fill that in as well. What you see here, though, are these edges around here that kind of look a little harsh. So this is just like any other selection. So let's go back to the beginning. I'll make a selection around this guy. This is like any other selection that you have in Photoshop. You can edit this selection in any way. You can use select and mask to make a better selection for that if you wanted to, or you could even go up to select and then you can go to modify and go to feather. But what we need to do here is change the feather radius. So I would change this to something like maybe 2 or 3 pixels if you're going to be doing this, because it's going to go in based on the pixel here. We'll press OK. It's going to feather that selection in. It's not going to look like much is happening now. Press Shift F5 and say content aware. It's going to fill it in and then give us a feathered selection around it. So it kind of creates a hazy effect around it. So it's not such a hard edge. Because by default, a selection is going to be a hard edge because this, like that, is just a selection exactly as that is. It's not like a brush that has a soft edge to it. So that's content aware fill. You can use content aware fill to fill just about anything in your image. Next, let's talk about content aware crop. Now, I know that this image is by far not the best photograph in the world, but it does help when we're using something like content aware crop. So I'm going to press C for our crop tool, which we haven't talked about yet, but the crop tool is pretty straightforward. With the crop tool here, we get to determine how much of a crop we want in our image. If I click on the edge and I bring this in, if I press and hold Shift, it'll maintain the aspect ratio as I do that. You see that? It's maintaining the aspect ratio of the image as I do that, and it helps crop the image in. We can also go to different ratios here. Let's say we want a 4:5, 5:7, 2:3. This will make it basically a 4:6, and it'll give us a crop. If you wanted to change this so that instead of being 2:3, it's then 3:2, you just press the reversal button and it does that. 2:3 or 4:6 happens to be the same aspect ratio as what I'm working with. So if I were to select maybe 4:5 and then hit that, you'll see a difference. It's going to crop off those edges. Whatever is in the darker area on the sides is what it crops off. So we can then click in here and move around to then see exactly where we'd want that crop to be. So I'm going to go ahead and press clear. I'm going to press escape to get out of the crop. While we're in the crop tool here, there is a straighten tool. And this straighten tool is very helpful because you can see that my horizon line is not straight. So I want to straighten that horizon line. What I would do is I would click right here, move this up and over this way, and straighten that horizon line out. What you'll notice though is when I do that, it's going to crop off the edges. And it crops off the edges in a way that if I were to zoom all the way out, it's cropping off the edges and it's showing me all that blue background back there, which yours might be white, okay? The way we can fix that is if we have this set to delete cropped pixels, it would delete everything outside of that crop and we wouldn't have to worry about those pixels anymore. But if we want to keep those pixels, we want to make sure that this is set to content aware. Now what that's going to do is when we set that to content aware, we can now make this go outside to the edge like this, all the way down to the edge at the bottom like this. And then if we go over here, scroll over and go over to the edge over here, I'm going to use my magnifying glass, control and space bar, right click and fit on screen. This will fill in those edges around the sides if we press content aware. And then once we press enter and commit to this crop, or we select this little checkbox here, Photoshop's going to do some analysis. It's going to look at all the pixels in the image and it's going to say, okay, I'll fill in those edges for you. And it's really smart by the way it does it. It takes a little selection that's slightly larger than that area on the outsides, and it basically inverts it and reverses it and fills in those edges. So as we straighten the image, we don't lose anything on the outside of the photo. So here we had an image that clearly needed some help here, because when we went to crop it and straighten it, we were going to lose the top edge or get very close to the top edge of this C-stack here. So when we use that content aware crop, it assesses the outside image, says, okay, I can fill that in for you, and voila, the outside edges are filled in, content aware crop. It's beautiful. Sometimes though, it might not be 100% accurate. So you might have to zoom in, pressing control and space bar and zoom in and see if there's a line. If there is some type of line where it made that correction, it's pretty easy to fix. You can just use your healing brush or any of your brushes that would do any healing, and you could alt click and then brush in where that line might be to create so that separation that might be there because of the content aware crop goes away. So I'll show you that again. We'll open this, go right back to the very beginning by going to the history palette. We're going to say crop tool, C for the crop tool. We don't want to delete the crop pixels, and we want to turn content aware on. So then when I go and straighten the image, straightening is a form of cropping, because in order to straighten this image out, it has to crop the outside edges. So I can move this up. You're going to see now, we see that in the background there, we actually get what looks like the layers, the clear layer back there. And then once I press enter after using content aware, or when I select this little check mark, Photoshop makes an adjustment, an assessment. It says, okay, I'm going to fill this in for you. Check it out. It grabs a little bit of the edge outside of the area there that's now the background that's clear. And it will usually just kind of make a selection and invert it over so that it just kind of carries over naturally. This thing works very well, almost all the time. I've never really seen a point where it doesn't work perfectly. And if there is just a slight line, just go back in there and do some of your other cloning or healing to patch up that line that you might see there. Content aware crop is your best friend because, and I'm going to go back here. So if we were to open this in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom and we were to make this straighten in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, guess what would happen? It would automatically crop that image off, and it would not allow you to do any content aware. It doesn't do content aware in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom when it comes to cropping. It can't add pixels to something that's not there. A RAW file, by its nature as being a RAW file, can't add more data on the outside edges of it because it's a RAW file. So a RAW editor like Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom will not be able to do that. You have to open it up in Photoshop. At that point, that RAW image then becomes pixel data that we can essentially work with. Now, it's pixels when you're at the raw level as well, but it becomes basically a 16-bit floating image where it's not quite a JPEG, it's not quite a TIFF, but it has pixels and it has data. And because we're working on layers in Photoshop, we can expand that data and fill it in with the content aware fill. It's awesome. Okay. The next tool I want to show you is actually the content aware move tool, which if you remember here, I didn't show you content aware move from this section here with all of our other tools, right? Well, basically what this is, it's a selection just like the patch tool would be. So let's say we want to take this window right here and we want to move it over here. What we could do here is we go into the mode here and we're going into move. If we go to extend, it'll make two of them. I'll show you that in a second. But we go into the move tool, and if we make a selection around there, I'm just going to do it with the marquee tool first. I'll use the marquee tool to make a selection around here. I'll go to content aware move, and if I click on this and move it over here, it's going to assess the pixels and it's going to say, okay, let's move this over. When I release, it magically is going to pull from this one, move it over here, grab the bricks from this one and move them over there. And now we've successfully moved this window, and it almost if you're not really looking at this with too much of a concerned eye, looks as if it's an exact placement, an exact movement, okay? The other way we can use this tool is if we want to make multiple copies of something. So let's say I want 2 windows. If I change this from move to extend, and I click this and I move this over like this, it will make 2 windows. Once I release, I'm going to release so that those lines look a little bit better this time. Once I release, Photoshop's going to make 2 windows that look identical next to each other. Because instead of moving this and replacing this, that's what move does. Move will replace this object. We are telling it to extend. Now you're going to see things here called structure and color. Let's go back to the beginning of this. Let's change the structure down to 1 and the color down to, well, let's do the color at 10 as far as variables are concerned. And then we'll move this, make a selection around this with the marquee tool, and then go back over to our content aware move tool. And I'll just move this over like this, get those lines set up, and that's good to go. Okay. Now we had that set to extend. But you can see the difference here. When the structure is set to 1, it kind of creates this haziness around it to try and blend it. We needed that structure to be higher because we're working on a rigid object. If you're working on like maybe foliage or something, you might want to reduce the structure a little bit. But when we're working on something that is structured, like this brick wall, we definitely want to make sure that the structure is a lot higher. Okay, so let's go ahead and now look at color. I'm going to go ahead and this time, instead of using the marquee tool, I'm just going to click and drag around this like this. Okay. And then now we are going to set this to move, and we're going to keep the color at 0. I'm going to click this and move this over. So instead of using the marquee tool this time, I'm going to just use the regular selection, the freeform selection, which is pretty much like the lasso tool. We can see here that when we have the color set to 0, it doesn't make that much of a difference. This is basically going to be a color blend. So the higher, usually the better, because it's going to blend it better. Let's see what happens when we do it like this. It looks like it made a little bit of a better color assessment when we have the color set to 10. So let's circle back to the very beginning of what we did with content aware fill. I want to show you something real quick. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a selection around here. Okay. And then I'm going to press Shift F5 and go to content aware. Press OK. And see how well Photoshop fills that in. You see what Photoshop is essentially doing with that tool is it's using that content aware fill that we started all this out with. Everything's really based upon that content aware fill. So this tool, being content aware move, is using content aware fill, and also something like the patch tool to maybe grab one thing, move it over, and fill in the content. So this content aware thing, you're going to see it all throughout Photoshop, and it's very useful in your workflow. We do have one more tool in this content aware toolbox that I want to show you before we close out this lesson, and that's going to be the content aware fill dialog. Now, in order to get into this dialog, you have to select something that you want to fill. So let's say we want to grab these 2 groups of people right here. We're going to grab these 2 groups of people. We want to fill these in with something around in the image. Photoshop generally is doing an automated process when it's doing that, isn't it? It's assessing the pixels that are around it, as we've seen before, and it replaces them. And it does a pretty good job. But what if you want more control over that? That's where this comes in. If you select something, you're going to have to select it first, because to get here, you have to go to Edit, and then you'll see right here, Content Aware Fill. All right. So this is different from the Content Aware Fill dialog that I showed you before. So I'm going to grab these 2 people again, these 2 groups of people, and then I'm going to go to Edit and then Content Aware Fill. Click that. Okay. So depending on how this is set up, you might get this pop-up that says this. I'm going to break this down and show you the 3 different sampling areas. This is kind of like what we talked about when we talk about the clone stamp tool and what we're going to sample. So let's just break this down. You're going to have some type of preview window. By default, it might be like this. It might be like this. If this window is pulled out, depending on how you started here, I started with this up here, you might have to shape these windows in a way that you can see them better. So I'm going to move this preview over so I can see this pretty well right here. I'm also going to drop my preview window down a little bit because I don't need it that big. So let's first start with the sampling area and how it's going to be shown. Well, let's show the sampling area. I like to do it at about a 50 to 75% opacity. That's just going to show us the area that Photoshop is going to be sampling to fill in our groups of people here. Now, the color that I like to choose is a magenta color. As you've seen many times before, I like to make this a pure magenta color so I can see it amongst almost any photograph, because we very rarely have magenta in our images, right? So that just gets us set up to what we're going to see when it starts to sample. Now, the three different sampling ways are going to be auto, which would be kind of like your content aware fill. And once we hit auto, you're going to see that it's going to select the area that it's actually sampling from. So now Photoshop is telling us, hey, you wanted me to fill this in. Well, in order for me to do that, I'm going to use this area to fill them in. So that's pretty smart, and it actually looks pretty good. Those people have been covered up pretty darn well, haven't they? So let's look at the next one. The next one is rectangular. With the rectangular, it's going to select all the pixels that are around it in a rectangle. Auto basically says, hey, I'm Photoshop, I'm pretty smart, and this is what I think I'm going to need in order to fill this space in. Rectangle just chooses a rectangle around them and finds the best pixels to fill them in with, and you see in that rectangular shape there. The next one over is the custom. Now the custom is going to say use the sampling brush to add to the sampling area in order to fill the selected region. Well, I don't need to see this again, so I'm going to say don't show again. You can select that too if you'd like. And then I'm going to use the sampling brush. So up here, these are the sampling brushes. Whether we want to add to that sample, we're going to press the plus, or minus from that sample, we'll press the minus. So if I just click right here like this, Photoshop is only going to use pixels that are in this little teeny tiny region in order to fill in those people. So let's press minus here again. That's okay, we'll press the plus sign. I'm gonna press the left bracket key to make my brush really small, and I'm just gonna click one click here. Okay, it says it can't fill because there's not enough pixels. So Photoshop needs a couple pixels. Let's see how many it actually needs in order to fill this space in. It looks like it needs a pretty good selection, okay? So that might be able to do it. But why I'm showing you this is that you want to make your sampling region a lot bigger. We get a really big smudge right here. Why? It's because we're telling this area to be filled in by, which is very big, to be filled in by a very small area. So I'm going to need to make a brush that's about the size of them, if not a little bit bigger, in order to make a really good sampling area to pull from to fill them in. And that looks pretty good. So I might even be able to go over here to these birds and select maybe some of these birds and see if Photoshop starts to fill in with different areas in the photo, okay? So depending on what I select, it's gonna auto-generate the preview here to see what it's gonna look like. Let's take a little bit more of this space over here and see what that's gonna fill that in with. And I think that's a good idea because over here we actually have a lot of this, the waves coming in that are pushing and pulling sand around that actually looks like the pushing and pulling of sand around right there as well, okay? So that's your sampling area options. These are your sampling overlays. Right here we have our fill settings. How do we want to do that? Do we want to do that with a high color adaptation? Or do we want to do that with a very high color adaptation? And depending on how you're going to do this, if we say no color adaptation, it's not going to do anything at all. But depending on how you do this, it's going to look at the colors that are around the area and try to adapt as best as it can. Assuming that very high is going to be very precise, that might be a good selection for this one because it does a good job of blending them together. You'd have to experiment with that to see if that's going to be right for you. Now, rotation adaptation, how do we want that to be? Low? Do we want that to be medium? Do we want that to be high? Or a full rotation? Okay, so we have to be careful with that one because basically what it's doing is it's grabbing this area here, and as it fills this in, it's rotating it. So I think we can go with none on that because it actually looked pretty good. Now, how do we want to fill in? Do we want to fill it in with scale? Or do we want to fill it in by mirroring? Meaning it's going to look at these pixels, mirror them in, and fill in, as you would see with something like the content aware crop, where it mirrors the top and right hand side or left hand side and bottom of what it is that it's trying to fill in order to get a good fill. So you can select that here, right here within scale or mirror. And it even gives you a little drop down. Mirror says it allows a horizontal flip of the content for a better match for good images with horizontal symmetry. We aren't really worried about that with this one. We aren't worried about symmetry in this one, so you could probably turn that off. Let's see what scale says. Allow content resizing for a better match, good for filling content with repeating patterns of different sizes under perspective. So that would be good for the wall that we saw before. Maybe not so good for this one because we want more of a random pattern. Then it's going to ask us here, what do we want to do with this? Do we want to create a new layer? Do we want to create a layer from this? Do we want to make a new layer or a duplicate layer in order to create this fill? Let's just say a new layer. We don't want to do it on the current layer because if we do it on the current layer, that is going to fill it in without giving us the duplicate, so that if we needed to fix it with a mask or something, we wouldn't be able to do that. So let's say a new layer and we'll press OK. So what that then does, is after you press Command or Control D to get out of there, it basically filled in those people with that content aware fill. Now this is different, as I said, from the content aware fill that I showed you before. If we press Command or Control and click on this grouping here, let's go back to this background here. If I go to Edit and go to Fill and then go to Content Aware, it doesn't give me much options here other than color adaptation. The Content Aware Fill dialog, the actual dialog, is different and it will give you a different look. It gives you more control, a lot more control, and you can probably do more with it than you would with something like this. So if I press OK here, let's look at the difference. Is it really going to be that different whether we use Content Aware Fill or we use the Content Aware Fill dialog? Not necessarily. It's really up to you and what the image is going to need at that given time. So we talked about quite a bit here. We covered a lot of territory. We covered the content aware fill, the old school content aware fill, content aware move, content aware crop, and now the content aware dialog, which is brand new for Photoshop CC. I think it was 2019 or 2020. So it's relatively new and it's a really powerful feature for you. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about layer transformations and really what that's going to mean. It's not like Transformers, the movie, okay? It doesn't make a weird sound when you do it either. But you'll see tomorrow when we talk about layer transformation.